so that you're only seeing the panelists or the moderator, or at the moment, me. Also, I will remind people again, just before we get started, but this panel is going to be recorded. So please be mindful of what you say and what your video screen will be. Generally speaking, it's probably best if everyone keeps their camera off. Although if you really would like us to see your engaged face while the panel is going on, by all means, leave it on. And Bob Tercero, I appreciate the chuckles. Also, as you have comments or questions, please go to the chat feature, which for most people will be at the bottom of the screen, but it could be at the side. Go to the chat and send us your thoughts. Russ Glazer, who is one of the co-hosts as well, will be reading those for you so that you'll be able to indirectly ask whatever appropriate questions are there. So let's see, I believe that we are now just about ready to start. One of our panelists unfortunately got kicked off by electronics, so the technology we'll be back on with him in a moment, I'm hoping, and then we can get started. So in the meantime, just wanted to remind you what we're all here for. This program is regarding racism and the death penalty, which I think is an especially timely topic right now, one that deserves much more time and attention than we are going to be able to touch tonight. But our moderator and our panelists are going to do their absolute best to give you some perspective that perhaps you don't have already, and we'll definitely do our best to keep our questions and keep our answers short so that we can get through as many as we can. And we're still waiting for one of our panelists. So if you all don't mind waiting for another moment or two. Just a reminder, this is one of our panel discussions by Columbia SoCal. That is the Columbia University Alumni Association, representing the 16 current and past schools, undergraduate and graduate, for Columbia University. And we represent approximately 14,000 area alums in Los Angeles, Ventura, Santa Barbara, Riverside, San Bernardino. I think I'm missing a county or two. We represent the 8 counties aside from San Diego in Southern California. San Diego is just a little bit too far, and so, oh, I forgot Orange County. So San Diego is just a little bit too far for, prior to COVID, for a lot of their members to participate in what we do, so we do separate programming from them. Just as an aside, we are not a new club. We have been around for somewhere between 70 and 80 years at this point. We have an active board, and we work very hard to try to be as representative of our community and also create programming that is of interest to our very diverse demographic. So along those lines, if any of you on this call today are interested in either getting involved or have an idea for either an event or other future programming post-COVID, we are very interested in your thoughts and are very open to a wide variety of viewpoints. So as long as we don't get involved in anything particularly difficult, like something very political or regarding religion, we are probably ready to jump in. All right, and speaking of jumping in, let's jump into our program. So,
Gary?
So let's see, we have the Racism, Criminal Justice, and Death Penalty in America program. And we are very excited to have you here. This will undoubtedly be a stimulating and informative panel discussion. And we are going to be hosted in a moment by our moderator, Stephen Rohde, who is the class of '69 from the law school. Just a reminder before I make the introduction for him, and there is our panelist, Gary. Okay, so we're gonna unmute Gary. Anyway, just a reminder, this program is being recorded. If anyone violates our policy for being appropriate, you will be kicked off the program and we will block you from rejoining. Please don't make us do that. So Stephen Rohde, our moderator, is a writer, lecturer, and political activist. He practiced constitutional law for almost 50 years. He is immediate past chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California and immediate past national chair of Bend the Arc, which is a Jewish partnership for justice. He is the founder and current chair of Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace, and he's a vice president of Death Penalty Focus. Mr. Rohde is the author of American Words of Freedom and Freedom of Assembly, which is part of the American Rights series, and numerous articles and book reviews on civil liberties and constitutional history for Los Angeles Review of Books. Hard to get it all in one breath. He does so much. He is also co-author of Foundations of Freedom, published by the Constitutional Rights Foundation, and is a recipient of Bend the Arc's Pursuit of Justice Award, and his work has been recognized by the ACLU, the American Bar Association, Beverly Hills Bar Association. He received his BA in Political Science from Northwestern and his JD from Columbia Law. For almost 50 years, he's practiced civil litigation, appellate law, and intellectual property and civil rights law. So as a reminder, please send any questions to the chat. Russ Glazer will do the reading, and without any further ado, here is Professor Rhodes.
Thank you very much, Joshua. It's such a pleasure to be convening this program through the Columbia University Alumni Association of Southern California. I spent 3 rigorous and vigorous years at Columbia Law School. This was the era of opposing the Vietnam War, of being politically active. It was an extraordinary legal training for me that has held me in good stead for almost 50 years. And I'm particularly proud to see how many Columbia alumni from all of the schools would join us tonight on such an important issue. I want to thank Joshua and Emily Berg and Courtney Wilkins, who helped set this up, and Russ Glazer, who's helping us tonight to put on this very timely program. A lot of people call their programs timely, but you cannot get any more timely than a federal court ruling today, which suspended 4 federal executions that were set to begin in Terre Haute, Indiana today at 4 p.m. And a few days from now and in August, the rest of those executions. None of the panelists tonight or myself are going to pull our punches that we oppose the death penalty. We believe, for the reasons that will be developed over the course of tonight's program, it is immoral, wrong, and ineffective. Opinions may vary in the group of almost 50 people that are with us tonight, and I respect that. And no one should feel cowed from asking questions in the chat box, which will give us an opportunity to address the serious issues that are involved in the death penalty. But I will say to you that the resumption of federal executions after a 17-year moratorium, a moratorium imposed by the courts because the very method of the state deliberately and calculatedly killing people is under serious examination and has been for these many years. Today, a federal judge in Washington ordered those 4 executions to be stayed because that litigation over lethal injections has not been fully and finally resolved. The judge found that the scientific evidence before the court overwhelmingly indicates that the 2019 protocol is very likely to cause plaintiffs, the inmates, extreme pain and needless suffering during their executions. And therefore, the petitioners in the federal case today had a likelihood of succeeding on their claim that the new one-drug protocol using pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, breached the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment in the 8th Amendment. So that's the level at which this issue is being debated. The federal judge cited a medical expert offered by the inmates that a high-dose injection of pentobarbital was caustic enough to rapidly fill a condemned man's lungs with bloody fluid, causing him to feel as if he were drowning for some time before losing consciousness. I'm using some of the specific language of this court opinion today to get across the gravity of the form of punishment that we're talking about tonight. We cannot dismiss the gravity of what it means when a government chooses to kill some of those that it has in its custody. The Department of Justice responded that they would appeal the injunction, and as we speak this evening, none of those appeals have succeeded. And in a court filing, the Justice Department said that its extensive planning for the July and August dates of execution, including training drills for 40 execution teams and booking of transportation and hotel rooms, quote, cannot easily be undone. If you detect some sarcasm in my voice, it is there. To elevate the inconvenience to the government of going forward with executions because of the time and effort they put into planning those executions and the transportation and hotel rooms involved, I think I am well within my role as a moderator to exhibit some skepticism and sarcasm. How can anyone put in the balance the balance of justice, the inconvenience to the government to go ahead with executions when such serious 8th Amendment constitutional issues have yet to be fully and finally decided? So that's the context in which we meet tonight. There were 4 executions set by Attorney General William Barr. These executions themselves each raise serious questions. The execution that was set to begin tonight of Daniel Lewis Lee raised serious questions because his more culpable co-defendant was given a life sentence while he was facing death, largely on the basis of junk science, according to his lawyers, and false evidence. 2 federal judges, both appointed by Republican presidents, found on 2 different grounds that Danny Louis Lee's death sentence was unfairly obtained and should be invalidated. And even the grandmother of one of the victims, of several of the victims, has opposed the execution because the victims' community is not monolithic on the question of the death penalty. To provide some background before we turn to our extraordinary panelists tonight, we should know that 22 states and the District of Columbia have abolished the death penalty in the United States. 28 states have it on the books. 3 have moratoriums in effect, including the state of California, in which we sit here today. We'll be covering the serious issues that are embedded in the death penalty throughout the evening, but it's important to know that the United States is an outlier in the world of civilized countries when it comes to the death penalty. We sit in league with China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt in administering the death penalty, while 70% of all other nations across the world and most of the nations that we look to for inspiration have abolished the death penalty. We have set this program tonight in the context of the reckoning over race that is going on in this country since the murder of George Floyd. We set it in the context of race because the death penalty is a crucible in the criminal justice system in which race and racism are so apparent, both in the administration, in the arrests, in the prosecution, in the flawed systems of jury selection, in prosecutorial misconduct, judicial misconduct, and the like. We know that people of color occupy the country's death rows out of all proportion to their membership in society. It is 6 more times likely for a Black person to be incarcerated than a white person. And here in our own state of California, our death row is overpopulated by people of color. That's because the criminal justice system is the legacy of white supremacy and racism in this country. And so in some high-level sense, it should come as no surprise that this deadly system would be a location for the worst forms of racism administered by our criminal justice system. We're going to be talking about those issues and others tonight. I'm so glad that I was able to invite 2 good friends to be panelists with me today, because I have deep respect for both of them, and I'm so eager for people to hear from them. I'll introduce them both. They will speak for about 20 minutes each. We'll have some inter-panel conversation, and then in your chat box, I encourage you to put in questions throughout the evening, and we'll try to get to those toward the latter third of our program tonight. You're about to meet, as our first panelist, an extraordinary man, Gary Tyler. Try to imagine yourself at 16 years old, falsely accused of murder, convicted of that murder, sent to death row at 17 years old, and that you would spend the next 42 years of your life struggling to prove your innocence. And that's the story we're going to hear from Gary Tyler tonight. He was finally released from Angola prison in April of 2016. It was then that I had the pleasure of meeting Gary because he went to work to support the second initiative that was on the ballot in California to abolish the death penalty. The first initiative was in 2012 and only lost by a few percentage points. The second initiative was in 2016, which Gary used all of his amazing gifts to struggle to pass. The County of Los Angeles, in which several of us reside tonight, passed those initiatives, but the state of California, by a few percentage points, was not ready yet to abolish the death penalty. Gary is an extraordinary community leader. He has spoken at Cal State Northridge, Cal State Long Beach, Loyola Marymount, Hastings Law School, Loyola Law School, and now he works in outreach and engagement as a worker in that cause among his community. Our second speaker is Professor Paula Mitchell. We're so privileged to have her with us today to give us a broad and deep look at the death penalty. Paula is legal director of Loyola Law School's Project for the Innocent and supervising attorney for Loyola's Ninth Circuit Appellate Clinic. She represents individuals whose claims of actual innocence, but who were imprisoned in California's state prison. With her fabulous team of lawyers, many of whom I've met, she has succeeded in overturning convictions and sentences and securing the release of at least 6 inmates, and perhaps more that I'm not aware of. She has written extensively on the death penalty, in several cases co-authored by former senior Ninth Circuit Judge Arthur Alicorn. Prior to joining Loyola Law School, Paula was counsel at Reed Smith, a prominent law firm in their appellate practice group. She's lectured around the world on the death penalty, and she's past chair of the State Bar of California Committee on Appellate Courts and is on the board of directors of the California Appellate Project. Let's first feel the immediacy and human dimension of our criminal justice system, and I'm so proud to introduce Gary Tyler.
Thank you, Professor Rohde. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary, and who's standing before you now is a former death row / juvenile lifer who served over 41 and a half years of his life in prison. On October the 7th, 1974, I was falsely accused of murder and tried and convicted of first-degree murder in 1975 and later given the death penalty, and was sentenced May 1st of 1976 to die in Louisiana electric chair. But due to a pending case before the United States Supreme Court, Roberts versus Louisiana, the state was compelled to postpone the execution date. When the United States Supreme Court came back in '77 and ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional due to the application of the death penalty, they was forced retroactively to resentence every man that was on death row. But Louisiana, in case, took upon his own, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, who stated that my execution should be carried on due to the fact that I was a juvenile at that time, and that Roberts versus Louisiana should not apply to my case. However, after several months of litigation, Louisiana Supreme Court ordered the lower court to resentence me to a 20-year life sentence. However, after being sentenced to a 20-year life sentence, I was sent to Angola, Louisiana. At that time, was considered one of the bloodiest prisons in the United States. Just imagine, a 17-year-old kid being sentenced to die and gone to a prison that was known of violence and mayhem. And how could someone like me, knowing that I had a sentencing date, be able to factor all of this in at the time? Just imagine the day I arrived, that I am being put on a tier, not knowing anyone on that tier at that time, but standing before that tier and seeing men who sticking out pieces of mirror in the hall to see who is that being led down the hall at that time. And not knowing any of these men at that time, not knowing whether they was death row prisoners or whether they was regular Angola inmates, in which case at that time, I was the only death row inmate put among regular prisons and Louisiana State Penitentiary. However, after a few hours of being on death row, one by one, the men came out to introduce themselves, to let me know that they were familiar with my case and that they, you could say, wholeheartedly disagreed with the way I a bunch of strangers, no one that I didn't even know. Later, I found out that I was wrong. I was confined among men that have murdered other men in prison, that have raped other men in prison, who have had caused quite a deal of mayhem, and that they were in maximum security due to that very behavior that they had. But these men somehow found it within themselves to step up, knowing that here's a kid being sentenced to die, and that how I was going to be able to fare out. So they came and lent their support. And as time went on, these men had proven that they were in my corner. And we're talking about where after 72 hours being on death row, that there's an incident that took place. And just imagine 11 to 12 o'clock at night, laying in a bunk and trying to get some sleep, and you hear this terrifying scream all of a sudden, not knowing where it comes from, but it sounded like it was on the very tier that I was on. And getting out of the bunk, I stood up to the bars trying to figure out where this noise was coming from. And suddenly I look up and I see this ball of fire where an inmate had threw gasoline on another prisoner and set him afire. And this inmate was screaming for mercy for his life. Can you imagine at that time what went through my head? That this is something that can happen to me. That May 1st probably wouldn't even be a date that I would meet because of the things that was taking place in the prison at that time. But it was terrifying. But somehow I mustered up the strength, along with the support of the men that was on a tier with me, to pour through that. And as time went on, they had, you could say, the shakedown crew came through, shaking down the cells, looking for contraband. And they come up with a shank in my cell And what I mean by the shank is that a knife, a homemade knife. And they locked me up in a dungeon, in which case called isolation. First write-up, first incident, and they gave me 20 days in isolation. And during that time that I was in isolation, there was a murder that took place in the cell next to me, where 3 white guys murdered a black inmate by the name of Scully. And being in the cell next to the incident when it took place, not knowing what really going on, because at that time, we only knew that this guy was in a cell with 2 inmates, with 2 white inmates, not 3. But later we found out that they brought the 3rd inmate from main prison into the cell. But it was what they would call a hit against the guy. And when we found, when they went to the inmates in the cell that next door, when they went to Highland for security, right then and there, we knew that something had took place when the inmates stated that they wanted out the cell. Now, that itself, knowing that they had murdered this guy in the cell, and here, having to witness a guy being set on fire, these are incidents that make you think whether you're gonna survive in this prison or not, because you're dealing with the worst of the worst. But I guess that at that time, I was blessed because I had men who recognized that I was someone who was innocently sentenced to die, put in a prison, a place that I shouldn't be at, and they rallied around to support me. As I sat in that cell, thinking about what had just happened, it made me thought about a lot, about how I was gonna really survive the challenges in this prison, knowing that what took place, something that had been systemically taking place within this prison before I got there, and now was taking place today. These very inmates helped educate me, helped me learn about prison life, and prepared me for life in general in prison. And after 18 months on death row, I was finally released into the main, we could say into what you could say maximum security, from death row to maximum security. And that's why I really got to know, you could say, the general guys in CCR, in which case called closed cell restriction. And that's why I met people like Herman Wallace, Albert Woodfox, Robert King, Niati Boat. These are guys who was really instrumental in helping me navigate prison life, and at the same time prepared me for the challenges in case eventually I was, you could say, be released from, you could say from the cell block itself. But that day came in October of 1988, when I was released into the general population. And everything that these men taught me about prison life prepared me to deal with the things that was taking place in, you can say, out of the main prison. And when I was released, I got involved. I got involved with prison activities, and I realized that the things that I was taught, I was able to teach others. I was able to perfect. I joined organizations, and the drama club was one of them in particular. And the first dramatic play that we did, called Execution, Who Had the Right? And what we did was that we built a mock electric chair. We had a jury, judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and we had a mock trial in the heart of Angola State Penitentiary, where we had outside guests, family members that attend that function. And it was so compelling until people right this day remembered that play itself. But that play was mainly developed and produced because there were men at that time that I knew personally that was executed. One is Robert Williams, the first execution that took place when they installed the electric chair in Louisiana. And later, Alvin Moore and Dalton Prejean. And I made a promise to myself that if I is fortunate enough to be released from prison, that I was going to take and join a movement to oppose the death penalty. Not only as a former death row inmate himself, but also having friends who have been executed while in Angola myself. And when the United States Supreme Court came down many years later in 2012, and in Miller versus Alabama, that was a light at the tunnel for me. But even though that ruling was that it was unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to life without giving them any meaningful possibility of ever getting out of prison, Louisiana once again felt that my case, along with other cases people who have been in the system for a long time, that retroactivity didn't apply to those of us who had been in the prison. It came to prison as juveniles. So it took almost 3 years later, and in Montgomery versus Louisiana, for the United States Supreme Court to order the state of Louisiana to make it retroactive in cases like mine and others. And April the 29th of 2016, I was finally released from the Louisiana State Penitentiary after 4 decades of being in prison itself. And as Professor Rohde mentioned, when I came to Los Angeles, one of the first things that happened, I was invited to attend the death penalty seminar. And I spoke before the crowd then, and I also was asked to speak, and you could say in a park, to give my story, to share my story with the public and explain why, as someone who opposed the death penalty, because I was not only a victim of a corrupt and criminal system, but I also had friends that have died in the electric chair. And also, unfortunately, I just found out a few days ago that a personal friend of mine who was on death row himself, who died from the coronavirus in Louisiana State Penitentiary, along with 17 other men, most of them that I knew in the prison themselves. And it really hit home because this guy, he was eligible for parole, and he was expecting to understand, to go before the parole board. But unfortunately, he did not meet that date. And I think about it, how fortunate I feel to have people like you all who oppose the death penalty, who also fought for over 4 decades for my freedom, and now giving me the opportunity to speak for those who not only unjustly sent to prison for crimes they didn't commit, but also falsely accused and given a death penalty, and having people to try to justify the execution of people by them saying that they have taken on the right to defend the sanctity of mankind, but at the same time violate that oath by sending people to prison for over what? Overzealous prosecution. Nothing is fair about that. And I said before you, and I tell you emphatically that I, you could say, felt beholding that fighting against the death penalty is one thing that I will be doing for the rest of my life until no man or woman is no longer facing execution in the United States.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary, very much.
Right.
Your story raises such serious questions, which I want to get to during the opportunity we'll have a little later. I'm extremely grateful for you for telling that story, and I know you've told it to anyone who will take the time to listen. I'd like to turn to Paula Mitchell to examine this punitive system we exist under in the United States, and to discuss some of the key issues involving the death penalty. Paula, please, go right ahead.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. Thanks for giving us this opportunity to shed some light on what cumulatively between the three of us has been decades and decades of fighting on this issue. I worked on my first death penalty case when I was in my 20s, before I ever even went to law school. I volunteered to help the Georgia, I forget what it's called, the group in Georgia that helps people on death row. And it's always been just something that I'm very passionate about. 15 years ago, after I was out of law school, I was clerking for Judge Arthur Alarcon on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. And Judge Alarcon was a lifelong Republican, not opposed to the death penalty. He has since passed. But I took him to task on his views, and we were particularly looking at what was going on in California at the time. There were over 600 people on death row then. Now there are, I think, over 750, but no one was getting executed. And the judge said, well, you know, why don't you dig into that? So I downloaded the state court trial record, the federal court habeas dockets on every single individual on death row in California at the time, just to try to figure out what's going on. Why is it taking so long? What's going on? And we published an article about that, kind of identifying where all of these bottlenecks are and what's going on in the system, and thinking about, how we might be able to sway people on their thoughts on the death penalty. And 5 years after that, we decided we wanted to write another article. And this time, realizing that people are generally very entrenched in their views. You're very against the death penalty, or you're very much in favor of it. So we decided, why don't we look at something that hasn't been done before? Let's look at the cost, the financial cost to a state like California that has so many people on death row. And let's see what it shows. The first thing we realized is that no one was collecting data or information on death penalty cases in California. There was no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places we could go and get our questions answered. And the same was true for the system at the federal level. So it actually took us 3 years to get the information that we needed to be able to try to calculate what the cost was. And what we discovered is that for the state of California, since 1978, taxpayers have spent $4 billion as of 2010 to have this death penalty system. At that time, I think 12 or 13 people had been executed, while over 100 had died of other causes on death row. Others had been released because their convictions were overturned. But what was really interesting about this is recognizing how little attention people were paying to the criminal justice system. They weren't looking at who was getting charged, who was getting overcharged, who was getting sentenced, who was getting over-sentenced, nothing. And that's changed so radically in the last 10 years. I've been here at the Project for the Innocent for the last 5 years. And in that time, I've learned more than I care to know about the problems and imperfections in our system. Gary's story, I wish I could say was unique, but so many people that I talk to, so many of my clients who have been released after decades in prison experience this extreme punishment, this horrible, the horrible conditions that we have. And what I've realized since I've been here is, you know, having law students in this clinic studying wrongful conviction cases is a perfect teaching tool for what's wrong in our system. We look very closely at all of the problems. And the other thing that's changed radically in the last 10 years is that data is now being collected. There is this amazing site called the National Registry of Exonerations. And what that does is it documents every individual from every state who has had their conviction overturned and the reasons why they were wrongfully convicted. And what that's allowed us to do is to start looking at the race of people who were charged with various crimes, the sentences they were given, why they were wrongfully convicted. In cases of African-American defendants, for example, one of the leading causes is eyewitness identification. And most of those cases involve cross-racial identification, misidentification. The amount of information that we have been able to pull together just from the wrongful conviction cases is staggering. It also leads me to think, you know, we're coming to this moment now that we are Black Lives Matter with the focus on race, in part because of body cams. We have more evidence now. Now we can actually look and say, we've known this has been going on for a long time, but now we're actually seeing the evidence. And it is disgusting. It's just untenable, it's unacceptable, and people are seeing it with their own eyes, they're reading it, and they're learning some of these things for the very first time, and you cannot not pay attention. So the cases we have in the clinic show that the death penalty, it doesn't just happen when you are sent to death row, it permeates the entire system. I'm representing someone right now who was 18 years old when a fire occurred. A person was killed in this fire, and she had the mental, the emotional equivalent of a 12-year-old child. They threatened her with the death penalty. They got her to agree to life without parole if the jury convicted, and she just got out after spending 40 years in prison for a crime that was not a crime, it was an accident. I could go case after case. They are particularly aggressive with juveniles, and they will bring the threat of the death penalty out in order to get a guilty plea. And it happens over and over again. So just keeping with that theme, I don't want to go over my time, but I just want to share a couple of slides with you that show the power of information. So if this works, let's see. Okay, so as you all probably know, the United States incarcerates more people than any country in the world. We have 1.5 million people in cages right now. And when you look at this graph, you see how much it has risen in the since 1978, actually coincidentally when the new death penalty was put in place. What you have to realize when you look at this is one reason there are so many people in prison, it's not just because we are convicting more people, we are putting them away forever. Life without the possibility of parole is meted out just with incredible vengeance. People are held in cages far longer than any kind of punishment has any utility. We have elderly people in their 70s and 80s who are incarcerated and using walkers. We have elderly people who, when the alarm goes off and everyone has to hit the deck, they go down and they can't get back up. This is just, it just doesn't make any sense from a public safety standpoint. It doesn't make any sense from a financial standpoint. And it's a reflection of who we are as a society. When you look at the breakdown of race, what you cannot escape is 1 in 3 Black men. This chart is based on people who would have been born in 2000 or 2001. 1 in 3 Black men will go to prison in their lifetime. And you cannot look at that statistic and say that this is an accident. It's the way the system is designed. You also can see that Blacks are more heavily prosecuted than any other race, and they are given much harsher sentences than any other race. This is also a clear evidence of the racism within the criminal justice system. They receive, on average, sentences that are 19% longer than whites who are sentenced for the very same crime. And then most recently, Berkeley published a study. They went back and did the hard work of digging through cases, and they found that they looked at 700 cases, and they found that prosecutors are more likely to strike Black and Latino jurors from juries than in over 70% of the cases, that's what they found. So again, more evidence of this systemic racism in the criminal justice system. It cannot be denied. The same is true for those people who are exonerated. Once you, and many, hundreds of people write to us every year here at this project. Many of them are African-American, saying that they were wrongfully convicted. And the statistics back that up. Black Americans are 3.5 to 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted than whites. So the, there we go. So the bottom line is, you know, the more we are able to focus our energy on getting the evidence, getting the data, showing what we all know is going on, but in such stark terms that it cannot be denied, you cannot look away, you cannot pretend this doesn't exist. The question that I would just leave you all with is a question I haven't really been able to answer for myself, but it's why are we so addicted to these extreme forms of punishment? Why do we have the death penalty? Why do we have life without the possibility of parole? Why do we have people incarcerated for decades, well into their 70s and 80s? What purpose is it serving? How is it benefiting public safety? How is it fair and equitable, given the disparity for people of color who are over incarcerated? Those are the questions that I think we really need to ask.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And we do have some questions that we'd love to get into. I know we've already we've been on for about an hour, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity for the engagement of the community. So, Steve Rohde, if you wouldn't mind helping us to direct some of these, Russ. Oh, I'm sorry.
Was there going to be a panel discussion next? I thought Steve was going to moderate. Steve, we can do
We're
this.
going to have a little inter-panel conversation, Joshua, if that's okay.
Of course. I just want to make sure we don't run out of time because there's some good questions
Yes.
here.
And if Russ puts the questions in the chat room for me, I'll see how many there are and I can adjust our time accordingly. I want to go back, Gary, to your case, and if the host will unmute you, it's, can you try to put us in the courtroom? Am I correct? You had an all-white jury, and eventually, what were the errors and flaws in the prosecution that your lawyers and the courts were finally, after over 4 decades, able to identify in order to prove your innocence?
Well, first of all, you know, the United States Supreme Court had ruled that the application of how they was given the death penalty back then in Louisiana, that it was only the jury's responsibility to find you guilty of a capital offense, and automatically he was given the death penalty without the jury making any recommendations about what type of sentence you should get. All right, let's start with that first. However, you could say the issues in my case, first was that the jury instruction, that at that time, it stated there was a extemporaneous jury objection rule that my attorney had failed to object to. One was that the way that the jury, the judge instructed the jury that they can assume that I intended to kill more than one individual by allegedly firing a single shot in a crowd, and that itself constituted first-degree murder and say premeditated murder with the intent to kill more than one person. All right, and also later that the evidence that was produced in court in reference to the weapon, you could say the .45 automatic, the alleged bullet that they said that they found at the scene, come to find out that the bullet that the Attorney General produced in court, that they did serological testing on the forensic, and it was disclosed that this bullet had no trace of ever passing through a human's body. But they introduced that bullet as though this was the bullet that killed the 13-year-old victim itself. Now, my attorneys, they got a court order to get testing done on the gun. So when they went to go pick up the alleged murder weapon, it come up missing. No one knew what happened to the weapon itself. All right. So, as well as the alleged witnesses that they stated that was sitting in a seat with me, in which case I was sitting in a seat with 2 males and not 1 or 2 or 3 females at that time. But later they recanted their testimony, stated how the state itself forced them to falsely testify against me as though I was the perpetrator that fired the gun itself. All right. And also, it was a thing where they alleged that there was, at the firing of the weapon, that there was a hand sticking out, which all the way to the elbow, that police testified to. You understand? And that the witnesses outside the bus didn't have no recollection to ever seeing an arm sticking out of the bus itself. And also it was stated that how could someone stick an arm out all the way to the elbow in the .45 automatic when you allege that you found the shell casing on the bus? When in the .45 automatic, shell casing eject. So if in it there, you would have found the shell casing on the ground, not inside the bus as they alleged at that time. Also, it was the bus driver who was an auxiliary police officer at that time of St. Charles Parish, that who for 20 years stated that he was an expert in firearms and he, you could say, carried a .45 automatic when he was in the service. And he stated that he know the sound of a weapon being discharged, especially a .45, and that the sound that they heard was a pop sound. Also, the alleged murder weapon that they said they found on the bus was reported missing from a police firing range out of another parish that was used by St. Charles Parish police officers.
Thank you, Gary. I mean, it's just shocking that you were not dismissed a week after you were arrested on those kinds of flaws, and that instead the system took so long. We are getting some excellent questions from, and why would I doubt a Columbia University audience having brilliant questions. Paula, two questions focus on some similar issues in terms of the quality of defense, and to look at wrongful convictions and whether there are statistics between those who have a public defender versus a private defender, and whether poverty and class, in addition or on top of race, lead to wrongful convictions.
Sure. Well, in California anyway, when a defendant is charged with a capital crime, they are given more in terms of resources for their defense. They're given 2 attorneys. The attorneys are supposed to meet some minimum qualifications, having handled serious felonies in the past. They are given some funds for investigation, but of course they don't have the entire LAPD at their disposal or anything near the resources that the DA's office has in those cases. With respect to public defenders versus not, you know, there are a number of excellent public defender offices in California. The LA County Public Defender's Office is quite good, as are some of the others around the state. I think that probably more than impugning the reputation of a public defender's office, I would say it really comes down much more to the disparity in resources that the defenders have compared to the DA's office. I know, for example, when we do our investigations here at the project, most of our cases are 20, 30, and as I mentioned, even 40 years old. So it takes substantial resources to go out and track down witnesses. And the same is true when you're handling a death penalty case. You really need to go out, you need to interview witnesses, you have to go to the crime scene, you have to go again, you have to find the right experts, you have to challenge every piece of evidence. And that costs a lot of money. And it does require quite a bit of skill and experience. So certainly if you were not poor and you had unlimited resources to hire a dream team, as some people have in the past, you might have a different outcome.
Let me stay with you, Paula, because there's a very interesting question. Let's say we have someone who is definitively guilty of first-degree murder, a confession, a video, DNA evidence, absolute proof of their guilt. If you are insistent, Paula, in abolishing the death penalty, what punishment should such a person receive? And if they get life in prison, aren't the costs themselves as high as the costs for the death penalty?
Well, you know, Steve, that I love that question because the answer is, of course, absolutely not. It is far cheaper to house somebody in prison for life than it is to sentence them to death because of all of the extra layers of procedural protections and the extra appeals that they are entitled to. When you sentence someone to death, they're provided for counsel at public expense until the time they die in prison or are executed. And that's where the $4 billion came from in part. But the other answer to that question is, I think, why don't we look at what countries around the world are doing? They are not executing, civilized countries are not executing people for crimes. They send them, they incarcerate them so that the public will be safe, and they give them rehabilitation, they give them programming, and they have their penal system reflect the society that they are.
Gary, turning back to you, and it goes back to the earlier question, and I know you are such a kind person, but there's always the question of ineffective assistance of counsel. And you get the counsel that you can afford. Someone once called the capital punishment, if you don't have the capital, you get the punishment. In your case, how did you afford your defense? And looking back, if the evidence was so obvious in terms of the pistol and the weapon and the bullet, in your experience, what was the nature of the effectiveness of your defense?
Well, first of all,
Camera, Gary.
you know, I come from a working class family, and my father basically worked 3 jobs, and my mother, she was a housekeeper, and out of desperation, they hired an attorney, not knowing that later on that he was basically a divorce attorney, and he never defended a capital murder case in his life. And even though there were signs, but at that time, you know, I'm very young, don't know anything about the legal system. And my parents, they were quite, you know, they didn't know anything either, no more than an attorney was an attorney, a defense attorney. And that, but the signs were showing that, for one, I only saw this guy 3 times in a year. And thanks to the guys in prison, in the parish jail at that time, first they had mentioned to me about getting a change of venue. I didn't know what change of venue meant at that time, but they were telling me about getting my trial transferred out of the parish into another parish, because nowhere in the world I was going to be able to receive a fair trial. In which case later, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals stated that I received a fundamentally unfair trial and was denied, you could say, my constitutional rights was violated, all right? So, and also when I mentioned to him about getting witnesses, he, well, let me, before I go on further with that, he stated that why should I get a change of venue when my family is from St. Charles Parish? So everybody know my family, that's what he stated, all right? That was his excuse. But when I told him in reference to about subpoenaing everybody on the bus, he felt that the court wouldn't allow him to subpoena everyone. So I gave him a list of people, you understand, people that I knew to be subpoenaed, but that never materialized the day of the trial itself, all right? And also when I mentioned earlier about the extemporaneous juror objection rule, when they stated that when my attorney failed to object to the juror instruction, that itself, they stated that left them powerless to do anything to overturn the conviction in my case. And when they asked the attorney about why he didn't object to the juror instruction rule, he stated that he did, but he done it in the judge's chamber, not in open court.
Those are infuriating to listen to now, let alone with you initially on death row and then in prison. It is appalling. We could have a whole session on ineffective assistance of counsel, because we know that lawyers have slept through portions of their trials, failed to raise appropriate objections, as your case shows.
And you know what's ironic about it? The same attorney that represented me in court later was an assistant district attorney in Shreveport.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paula, someone has asked about the victims in all of this, the victims' families and their need for closure, and why don't we put that in the balance when we're weighing this form of punishment? What's your response?
Well, I think that it is very much in the balance. Certainly in California, over the last 30 or so years, there have been voter initiatives that have caused the pendulum to swing very, very far on the side of victims and taking into account their experience. I think that what we're seeing increasingly is that families of victims are coming forward and speaking out, some of them very vocally, about the fact that the death penalty does not bring closure to their family, that it adds more trauma and stress. It is not really the kind of balm that they need to heal. In California, especially because people are on death row for 30, 40 years before their execution date even becomes a question, those families are waiting all of those decades. They've been told that their, vengeance is coming or that their closure is coming, and they wait and wait and wait. And it's hard to believe that that is really something that would be comforting.
Yes, I've talked to victims' families. I mentioned this briefly at the outset. It is not monolithic that all victims' families support the death penalty. There are organizations across this country, murder victims' families against the death penalty and murder victims' families for human rights. I know the story of a man, Bud Welsh, when the Oklahoma bombing occurred and Timothy McVeigh was convicted of that terrible crime. Bud Welsh's daughter was killed, and Bud Welsh supported the death penalty, and he wanted to go out, and if he could have found a way to strangle Timothy McVeigh with his own hands, he would have done so. But he began to go through a process of what does it gain for another human being to be killed. He couldn't bring back his daughter, and he knew his daughter herself had opposed the death penalty. Bud Welsh went through an extraordinary transition in his thinking on the death penalty. And on the night of Timothy McVeigh's execution, Bud Welsh knew there was only one place on the face of the earth he should be, and that was sitting next to Timothy McVeigh's father and holding his hand as news came in that Timothy McVeigh was now losing his child as Bud Welsh had lost his. That story for me was so powerful. I got to meet Bud Welsh during our campaigns for abolition. He was an example of people who completely transformed themselves in looking and turning away from vengeance and not believing the prosecutor's myth of closure, as if when another human being is executed, that somehow is going to bring closure to your loss of your loved one. And there's a powerful movement in this country of victims and victims' families who oppose the death penalty. We have time for just a few more questions. Paula, it's been asked, is there something we could do to fix the death penalty? We had a Proposition 66 on the ballot in 2016, was meant to speed up and fix the death penalty. What's been the outcome of that?
Look, California's death penalty is not fixable, period. It is by design doomed to fail. And the reasons are many, but the first one to point to is we only have so many justices on the California Supreme Court, and the cases that they must review. Now, until very recently, it was taking 15 and sometimes 20 years for somebody who was convicted and sentenced to death to get a first appeal before the California Supreme Court. There's just no framework in place to have an effective death penalty. I think that that's in part by design, because I think that people are largely very ambivalent. They want to be able to say that they have a death penalty. They want to say we're tough on crime. They want to say, honestly, I think that a lot of people on the prosecution side fear losing the death penalty because they do use it to threaten so many defendants to get a plea. So I am not optimistic that California's death penalty is fixable. I'm also I'm certain that I'm on the right side of history on this issue. State after state is starting to abolish. California now has a moratorium. Oregon has a moratorium. The Catholic Church is against the death penalty. Nations across the country are pointing the finger at the United States and talking about our death penalty system as a human rights violation writ large. It's time for this particular punishment to go. And I think that in California anyway, it's breathing its last breaths. And I believe that once California abolishes the death penalty, the other states will follow soon thereafter. Keep in mind, California is the largest death penalty state on an order of magnitude. We have 750 people on death row. The next state closest is Florida, and they have 340. So California is very important in this debate. If California ends the death penalty, it's going to be, I hope, the beginning of the falling of additional dominoes.
As we begin to close, someone has asked in the chat, what can we do about it if these arguments have been persuasive? We've pointed out that in 2012 and 2016, ballot measures were offered to the people of California to abolish the death penalty. The death penalty came in as a ballot measure, the Briggs Initiative, and it must leave unless held unconstitutional by the courts by a vote of the people. In the last election, the son of Briggs, Ron Briggs, was in our corner, realizing after all of the experience and all of the issues we've talked about tonight, he could no longer support the initiative which bore his father's name. So there is a move afoot to put it on the ballot in a future election. Ballot measures go on the ballot either by signature gathering or by the state legislature. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, early in his tenure declared a moratorium on executions. So I think we know where he stands. If a ballot measure goes on the ballot through the legislature, it could save $2 million, the cost of signature gathering, which could be put into education and advocacy. I'm part of Death Penalty Focus, a statewide and really national organization opposed to the death penalty, which is at deathpenalty.org online, and has a rigorous program of advocacy and education and organizing. You can look at the daily newspapers and letters to the editor. This morning, I woke up to the empty promises of Prop 66 in the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times has been cogently and intelligently opposed to the death penalty. And it is again, and it says, given the failures of the death penalty, the infuriatingly disproportionate weight that lands on people of color and the poor and the broken promises of Prop 66, California voters should be given another chance to vote it away and then to do so. So I think there are many opportunities for us to stay educated, to inform our friends and families. It's a tough issue initially. Popularity of the death penalty has continued to drop. Some polls show that less than 50% of the people support the death penalty. So as we close, Gary, what is your final message to the people listening, and since this is being recorded, to others who may see it in the future, when you look out on the audiences that you've spoken to about this form of punishment?
Well, I think that if we tend to make some type of headway in abolishing the death penalty, we need to start holding our representatives accountable. We need to hold a fire to their feet. And we also need to start electing people who's against the death penalty, like people that run for district attorney's office. We feel that if an individual is pro-capital punishment, then we should vote against that individual and get someone to our liking, because that is something that is that is not popular within people of color communities. And get someone that's going to represent our community, someone that's going to represent the people as a whole, and not using the death penalty as a means of politics and lying to people about they're going to make death penalty more expedient, when we know that Proposition 66 was just only a ploy.
Thank you, Gary. You're frozen on mine. Go ahead.
Yeah, start
What was your
electing
last
people.
thought?
Yeah, we need to start electing people that basically oppose the death penalty. That's what we need to start doing. You know.
Thank you. Thank you for your humanity. I know how little hatred and anger you feel for all the people that led to your wrongful conviction, and that you've turned your life to one of reconciliation and rehabilitation and peace. And we're all grateful for that.
Remember, I didn't only fight for my life, but also fought for my humanity, even though they robbed me of my innocence. You know?
Thank you.
I fought for my humanity for others as well.
Paula, your last words as we wrap up this very important topic.
Well, I think Gary said it very well. I think you can be in touch with your state representatives. You can make your voice heard about how this is just not a reflection of the society we are or that we want. It's not an effective use of our limited resources in the state. And I just want to say about Gary and his humanity and his lack of anger. I see this so often in my clients who have been sentenced and spent decades in prison for crimes they did not commit, and wisely they get out and they decide, they make a conscious decision, they're not going to waste another minute looking back and being angry. They're going to put everything they have into looking forward and trying to make a better system and a better world for people, and try to heal as much as they can while doing whatever they can to make sure this doesn't happen.
Thank you, Paula. Your work in this area has been immense. And the hard research you've done has supported these initiatives and had a huge impact. I just want to close by thanking everyone for taking an hour and a half on an evening when you have a lot of other Zoom choices. This is a very important issue. You may have changed your mind. You may have learned something tonight you didn't know. We hope you'll continue to consider this very important issue. And I'm immensely grateful to Columbia University, Southern California alumni for hosting this program tonight. And I'll turn it back to Joshua.
Thank you very much. Steve Rohde, you are a gentleman, a scholar, and you are clearly very well attuned to what is going on. Paula and Gary, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for teaching us, for sharing your perspectives. And I do hope that there are people here on the line who feel as though they know a little bit more about the topic now. Whether or not they've changed their minds, that's the American way. We let people make their own choices. But I sincerely hope that this has moved the needle a little.
Yes.
Now, in closing, just wanted to remind all of you this was a Columbia University of Southern California event. We are very happy that you all joined us. We have other events coming up that we would love to have any of you participate in. You can see that we like to do good quality programming. Coming up In 3 days, we have the virtual happy hour, which starts at 5:30. We have 2 weeks from today, we have a self-care in the age of a pandemic. Very important to keep your mental and physical health. And following in that, on August 1st, we have a morning ritual reset, gentle yoga and meditation by Emily Berg, our own in-house yoga specialist, who is also our club president. We have book club. The book of the month is Queen of the South. And then we have an online writing workshop coming up in September with alumna Robin Finn. So there's always new programming being added. And as I said at the beginning, we are very, very open to new programming, original content, new ideas, and whatever it is that you would like to see. If you're not seeing it yet, please let us know and we would be happy to consider it.
Joshua?
Yes.
If anyone on this program would like to reach me to follow up on what we've been discussing, I'm sure they have your email or a direct email to the Southern California Alumni Association. If they've contacted them with that inquiry, then they can put them in touch with me.
Sounds great. We will take care of that definitely. And thanks for the reminder. So again, thank everyone for being here tonight. And anything that we can do for you on this topic, please reach out and we'll either forward it to Steve Rohde or there's certainly the Loyola Innocence Project. And happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.